Answers in Genesis is wrong about Solomon, and they have terrible research standards. Let me explain. So I was browsing the internet looking for a video idea for this new video format I'm doing when I came across this Answers in Genesis article, which was entitled War and Conquest in Genesis 1, and written by Simon Turpin, a speaker and the leader of the UK chapter of Answers in Genesis. Turpin's main point of the article was to try to defend the position that the Hebrew words kavash and radah used in Genesis 1:26-28, which was the command God gave to humans to rule and subdue the earth, do not have a violent or coercive context to them. To try to prove that there wasn't animal death before the fall, which is one of the main tenets of young earth creationism. Now, I usually could not care less. My main interests are archaeology and Israelite history. While I heavily disagree with young earth creationists, this wasn't enough for me to make a video on. However, Turpin's main argument was the citing of verses where he views that kavash and radah do not have a violent or coercive context, to try to prove that the words aren't always harsh in nature. In my opinion, virtually all these claims are wrong, but still not egregious or in my area of interest to make a video on. But then I saw what Turpin said about King Solomon, and immediately my spine shuddered and I could not hold back. To give context, he first cites a passage in Leviticus where he claims radah is used in the context of a, quote, benevolent, peaceful rule, even though the passage explicitly has to do with slavery, which if anything validates that radah has a violent and coercive meaning. However, that isn't my main grievance, because Turpin then says, quote, likewise, King Solomon brought about a benevolent rule that resulted in peace and safety with each man under his own fig tree. Solomon even spoke of beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish. These are the same categories of animals that mankind was used to rule over in Genesis 1. God created mankind to be his viceroys, royal figures who would represent him by ruling wisely over his creation. Turpin goes on to say that this idea of kingship cannot be coercive or oppressive, citing a Jewish scholar named Nahum Sarana, saying, quote, the human race is not inherently sovereign, but enjoys its dominion solely by the grace of God. Furthermore, the model of kingship here presupposed is Israelite, according to which the monarch does not possess unrestrained power and authority. The limits of his rule are carefully defined and circumscribed by divine law, so that kingship is to be exercised with responsibility and is subject to accountability. These are the statements I'll be addressing today. However, I suggest reading the full article so you can understand the arguments and so I don't take things out of context. But when I read this, I went into full nerd rage mode because this is just plain wrong. I mean, sure, Answers in Genesis is not a good academic institution by any means. I wouldn't even call it academic, but this just aggravated me. 1 Kings 4:24 does not represent an entirely peaceful rule underneath King Solomon. In fact, quite the opposite. If you look at the context in 1 Kings 4, the ascension of Solomon's reign, and Near Eastern politics, it becomes increasingly clear that Solomon's reign was not peaceful. Rather, the end result described in the passage was. Along with this, Sarna's idea of Israelite kingship is just wrong. Turpin being this wrong collectively just reflects the extremely low research standards of Answers in Genesis. However, to prove my point, we need to analyze the claims Turpin is making to support his idea that there was no animal death before the fall, and then address them independently. Claim 1. The word radah does not necessarily imply a violent, coercive context. Claim 2. Solomon's rule was entirely peaceful, meaning that radah in this passage couldn't have been used in a violent, coercive context. Claim 3. God created mankind to be viceroys, because the word radah can refer to kingship, and according to the Israelite model of kingship, monarchs do not possess unrestrained power and authority, and thus radah cannot refer to a violent, coercive rule in Genesis. So first, I want to address Turpin's primary claim that radah can have a peaceful or non-coercive context. According to Ben Stanhope, a scholar who has heavily criticized Answers in Genesis, radah means descending upon or treading, and is always used to communicate some sort of oppression, harshness, or coercive control, and is not used in the context of ruling one's own people unless it applies some sort of harshness or oppression. The Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, or halot, which is the standard lexicon used by scholars when discussing the Hebrew Bible, corroborates this. According to halot, radah means to tread the winepress and to rule, with the associated meaning of oppression. Now, Turpin isn't wrong simply because scholars agree that radah always has a violent, coercive context, because the whole point of his article is to address this claim. However, there's etymological backing for the scholarly definition. The Akkadian term redu was used by the Neo-Syrians to denote the Assyrian king's rule of foreign lands. But if you think that this usage of the Akkadian term Redu is relevant to the Hebrew term Radah, keep in mind that Israel was actually ruled by the Neo-Assyrians for a large amount of time, and they were violently oppressed and subjugated. Along with this, other cognates to Radah also have similar meanings in usage, such as in Tigri, Arabic, and numerous dialects or sublanguages of Aramaic, such as Mandaic, Syriac, and Christian Palestinian Aramaic. Furthermore, the verses Turpin and other critics cite to try to disprove the scholarly consensus do actually reflect a violent, coercive, or harsh context. As I mentioned prior, Leviticus 25 involves slavery and ruling over people harshly. Lamentations 1:13 involves God casting down fire on the author of Lamentations. Psalm 68:27 involves the tribe of Israel going to war against their enemies, with the tribe of Benjamin leading the campaign. Psalm 49:14 involves the righteous ruling over the wicked in Sheol, the Hebrew realm of the dead, and other verses like 1 Kings 4:24, 2 Chronicles 8:10, 1 Kings 9:23, 1 Kings 5:16, and Psalm 72:8 involves Solomon's reign, which I will discuss further in the video. But funnily enough, even the commentary Turpin cites agrees with this view of Radah. Sarna says, quote, "The verbs used here in verse 28, Radah and Kavash, express the coercive power of the monarch, consonant with the explanation just given for the image of God." However, Sarna has to disagree with the idea that the verse gave license to exploit nature for other theological reasons that are cited in the article by Turpin. Also, I didn't even take that quote out of context. You could do that with some of my sources, but here's Sarna's full quote. I did not take it out of context. This is absolutely hilarious how Turpin proceeds to ignore that statement by his own source he cites. I find it funny how he's so cocky and dismisses the claims on Radah as, quote, unbiblical, yet his own sources agree with this interpretation. But of course, Turpin doesn't mention that. Now, I usually wouldn't dog on him just for this because sources will disagree with their conclusions. That's just a part of academics. However, what Sarna says here directly plays into the idea that Turpin cites. You cannot ignore it. You have to address it. So either Turpin is ignorant and had tunnel vision when he wrote this, or he thinks the average young earth creationist won't critique and check his work and knows he can get away with it. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his research laziness. It gets worse. The second claim Turpin proposes is that because Radah was used to describe Solomon's reign, which according to him, quote, brought about a benevolent rule that resulted in peace and safety, with each man under his own fig tree, end quote. According to him, this means Radah can describe a non-coercive, non-violent context of rule. This is probably the most egregious claim in my opinion, given the context of the passage, especially for me as someone who heavily studies Israelite and Near Eastern archaeology and history. The verse he cites is 1 Kings 4:24-26, which says, "For Solomon had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides." During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, all of them under their vines and fig trees. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Turpin cites this verse because of the statement, Solomon had peace on all sides, and Judah and Israel lived in safety. Turpin believes because of this peace, a violent, coercive meaning of Radah cannot be valid. However, it is clear that Solomon's reign was not entirely peaceful. Anyone who has read the passages describing Solomon's reign knows this. Solomon's ascension to the throne itself was very violent, bloody, and not peaceful. The first two chapters of 1 Kings display this. Furthermore, the idea that Solomon's entire reign was peaceful and non-coercive is disproved in the same passage that Turpin cites. 1 Kings 4:21 states, quote, Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Stephen Ortiz, former professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, notes that this verse refers to a tributary and a vassalage system. This may seem insignificant, however, the process of getting tribute in the Near East itself is violent and coercive. The Near Eastern concept of vassalage was a patronage system, where tributary states and their overlords would operate within political contracts that would benefit both parties. These patronage relationships involved heavy amounts of coercion, even if it was somewhat beneficial to both parties. and most notably, this was practiced by the Hittites during the Late Bronze Age with their vassals in northern Canaan. Although there were a few exceptions, most notably Egypt. Egypt had a concept of patronage as well, however this was in its socio-political bond with its subjects rather than the political system like other Near Eastern powers. Unlike the Asiatic states of the Near East, Egypt used a sort of bureaucratic domination to force the vassal's submission to the pharaoh. If the Asiatic patronage system, or the practices of the Egyptian pharaoh, is applied to Solomon's rule, then a violent or coercive meaning of Radah is fully appropriate for the passage. Especially considering the author of the passage is trying to emphasize the fact that Solomon was extracting tribute and exploited the Levant. Regardless of whether or not Solomon's tributary system was similar to a patronage system or the Egyptian system, all tributary systems require some sort of violence or coercion. A state doesn't just magically become your vassal if you ask it nicely. Along with this, the existence of this coercive tributary system does not contradict 1 Kings 4:24's idea of peace. The statement, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, refers strictly to the bounds of Solomon's political kingdom, not necessarily the kingdoms Solomon held vassalage. To quote Ben Stanhope, yes, Solomon's rule resulted in peace, but the point is that peace was upheld here at force of military domination, through which the text emphasizes Solomon coerced tributes from these nations. Honestly, with the way Turpin cited these verses, I'm starting to think whenever he was writing the article, he went to Bible Hub, looked at Radah and Strong's Concordance, then cherry-picked verses and took them way out of context. The fact Turpin completely ignores this is insane and shows he didn't even bother to examine the context or do any form of research. But wait, it gets worse. Also, while Turpin doesn't cite these verses, I will give him credit on that, I've seen many young earth creationists and critics cite 2 Chronicles 8:10, 1 Kings 9:23, 1 Kings 5:16, and Psalm 72:8 as more examples where Radah does not refer to a harsh or oppressive rule. Considering they all relate to Solomon's rule, I will address them here. 2 Chronicles 8:10, 1 Kings 9:23, and 1 Kings 5:16 all refer to Solomon's forced labor programs. It's even addressed in the passage in 1 Kings 5:13. In these instances, the Israelites were forced to do labor or were compelled by their current circumstances. According to Robert Alter, Israelite forced laborers paid what amounted to a tax through their labor for a limited period of time. So those passages refer to worker exploitation by Solomon and his deputies, so Radah would have been completely appropriate. Furthermore, Psalm 72:8 referred to King Solomon having dominion over the entire Levant, and as mentioned earlier, this dominion was highly coercive and exploitative. This last claim completely blew me away. Like, I know Answers in Genesis has bad research standards, but this takes it to a whole nother level. So the last claim Turpin makes is God created mankind to be his viceroys, royal figures who would represent him by ruling wisely over his creation. The word Radah is often used of royal rule. Now, he's not wrong that Radah is highly associated with royal rule. As I mentioned earlier, an etymological parallel of Radah was used to refer to royal rule. And even in the Hebrew Bible, there is a strong connection, albeit with some exceptions. However, where he is wrong though is that humanity was made to be viceroys, representing God and to rule over his creation wisely, but I will address that in a minute. However, this isn't the most egregious part of the claim. The worst part about it is what comes next. Turpin then claims that the Israelite model of kingship he assumes as a prerequisite for the understanding of kingship in the passage is that the monarch does not possess unrestrained power and authority. The limits of his rule are carefully defined and circumcised by divine law, so that kingship is to be exercised with responsibility and is subject to accountability. He cites this from Nahum Sarna, but his assumption about Israelite kingship is just plain and simply wrong. I don't know where Sarna and later Turpin got this idea that Israel's monarchy was like some sort of system that kept the king in check like the American ideal of federalism, but it's just wrong. Sarna does not elaborate further in his commentary. He might have gotten it from Isaiah 11, I don't know for sure, but his idea of Israelite kingship is remarkably false. First though, I will say he is right that Israelite kingship was involved in divine law, but where he is very wrong is the claim that there were limits to the king's power, because in reality, there are no limits to the Israelite king's rule. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Israel's ideas of kingship laid out in the Bible are very similar to the Mesopotamian ideas of kingship in the sense that it was a divine institution. There were not necessarily limits on the king's power because of this, because the idea that the king was a divine institution legitimized nearly everything the king did. The Israelite king was divinely elected and was established in his position by God. Responsibility and accountability were not a thing in the Israelite monarchy, because ideologically speaking, he was elected by God. As Garbowski W. Ahlstrbm, former professor of Old Testament and ancient Palestinian studies at the University of Chicago, put it, speaking as a historian, one may say that the election and appointment of a king of Israel is the choice of the people, or of his father, or perhaps of the court. But in the last analysis, even if this is true, ideologically it is Yahweh, not the people who chooses the king. The choice must be made by Yahweh, and this is true both in Israel and in Judah. This is further supported by the fact in 1 Samuel 8, where the prophet Samuel laid out the rights of kingship, there's no accountability whatsoever in those rights. Also, Samuel even says in the passage, quote, "And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So Turpin's reliance on Sarna's idea that the king is subject to accountability by the people is not just wrong, it contradicts what the text says. Turpin proposes that Adam and Eve acted as a sort of Israelite kingship, yet he couldn't even get the kingship model right. Furthermore, Turpin's idea that humans are supposed to act as viceroys who would represent God in ruling wisely as a sort of duty where humans have accountability over his creation is not true. Joshua John Van E states, quote, "Kavash and Radah together describe humankind's unique position and duty. The former focuses on the pursuit of dominion over the animals and the latter on the exercise of that dominion. They imply conflict in the use of force. Through these commands, God grants humans the right to use animals for their purposes." I honestly do not know how this article was published with the lack of research on Turpin's part, other than the conclusion that Answers in Genesis research standards are a joke, because Turpin only cites two sources, Sarna's commentary and the opinion of another scholar on the world before the fall. Absolutely nothing else is given for his conclusions on the meaning of Radah, Solomon, or his ideas on Israelite kingship. This just shows the laziness on Answers in Genesis' part to not even check if any of his statements are wrong. He doesn't even mention Joshua John Van E's thesis, which possesses the main point that animal death existed in Genesis 1, and was cited by the guy Turpin is responding to in the article. He probably didn't even bother to read it. Also, it's not like Turpin is not an quote-unquote academic and doesn't know research standards. He has a bachelor's degree in biblical and intercultural studies, and a master's in theology. He's more educated than me. He should know better. Answers in Genesis, you wonder why nobody respects you? Because when a high school teenager like me is correcting you and calling out your paid on-staff writer who possesses a master's degree for his research standards, or lack thereof, you know you have a problem. I've noticed Answers in Genesis staff affiliates also have a massive amount of arrogance, despite everyone trashing them, destroying them in debates, and having piss-poor research standards. It's funny how they think they're some sort of Sigma male giga-chad defending the Bible against the virgin beta male evolutionists, but they're not. If anything, they're clowns, and not like a clown that causes chaos to send a message like the Joker. No, they're clowns in Times Square that get arrested for public intoxication. I will say this though, I have nothing against young earth creationists. In fact, I used to be one myself. However, I am against Answers in Genesis leadership, due to their laziness and perpetuating an idea they barely can even hold up. If you want to make a theological worldview, at least have some support to it. And not the only support being simply cracking open the good old King James and reading it at its most superficial point through a 21st century context. Because that is bound for disaster. First off, I'd like to thank the viewer for watching, as you watching this video helps grow the channel. This video was a bit different format than usual. I want to call this format a Rowdy Rant, where I evaluate takes and debunk them in a rowdy way. I will not abandon my old style videos, rather this will be a sort of filler video in between major research videos I make, because my research and writing process takes longer and has more effort than Answers in Genesis articles. So let me know your thoughts on this format. If I get some positive feedback on it, ignoring the angry young earth creationists, I will continue making these videos in between major research videos. However, on the topic of my research videos, I currently am working on a new video on ancient Canaan. It will be a start of a new series where I go over ancient Israel's history from Israel's emergence to the time of Christ. It's taking me a while though, because I, for the life of me, cannot complete my reading list. It's like a Hydra. Finish one book, two more take its place. However, it will happen. I just need some time to read and write the script, and we'll probably be set for one of the best videos I've ever made. So, with that being said, I better get to work. Chicken out.
If you love you some Rowdy, let me hear